Forget about horned helmets and glorious battles. Incidentally, horned helmets were an invention of artist Carl Emil Doppler for Wagner's 1876 opera. Real Vikings wore simple conical helmets, if they wore any at all. The first and most likely enemy to kill you on a Viking expedition wasn't a Saxon axe, but your own stomach. Survival statistics for sea voyages of that era are unknown, but they were appalling. Dehydration from seasickness, dysentery from foul water, and sepsis from a simple scratch were far more real threats than an enemy's sword. This is not a story about how Vikings fought, but about how they simply survived the journey. To understand their resilience, one must understand their motivation. Scandinavia from the 8th to the 11th century wasn't a paradisiacal fjord. It was a harsh land with a shortage of arable land, constant internal conflicts, and a rigid social hierarchy where younger sons often inherited nothing. Harvests grew scarcer, and being the younger son of a landless farmer meant virtually no prospects. An expedition wasn't merely a thirst for profit, but a social elevator, the sole chance to gain fame, wealth, and land. It was a kind of startup with incredibly high risk and potentially huge returns. This was a desperate leap out of hopelessness, not a pleasure cruise. Who manned the oars? Not professional soldiers. Most were ordinary farmers, fishermen, and traders who became warriors for the summer. It was a militia system where free men were obligated to serve the king. It's as if today an Iowa farmer were obligated to abandon his tractor every summer and embark on a military campaign to another continent. They had no special training, no vaccinations, and no knowledge of hygiene. Their bodies were tougher than ours, but archaeological findings of skeletons show arthritis and worn teeth. Traces of incredibly hard physical labor, not superhuman health. Their main weapon wasn't an axe, but an incredible tolerance for hardship that modern humans have lost. And the main challenge on this journey was the ship itself. Their longship was a marvel of engineering, long, narrow, with a flexible hull and an incredibly shallow draft. The famous Gokstad ship had a draft of less than a meter, or about 3 feet. This allowed it to navigate even the shallowest rivers, where no other seagoing vessel of the time could pass. It was like the stealth bomber of its era, appearing where no one expected it. But this ingenious design, built for speed and surprise, had a drawback. The ship was completely open, no cabins, no awnings, not the slightest shelter. You were exposed 24 hours a day to scorching sun, biting winds, and icy spray from the North Sea. Now imagine the space. A standard 25-meter long ship, slightly longer than a modern tractor trailer, accommodated 40 to 60 men. Personal space? 0. A simple calculation shows that each person had less than 2 square meters of area. That's less than a standard prison cell, and you shared this cell with oars, rigging, and provisions barrels. You slept, ate, and rode side by side with dozens of sweaty, sick, and irritable men. At night, you covered yourself with your own cloak, lying on a chest that held your belongings and doubled as a rowing bench. Constant noise, cramped quarters, and pitching. When the wind died down, the human engine took over. Rowing for many hours, sometimes even days, was exhausting, monotonous labor. This wasn't modern gym rowing. It was like doing heavy deadlifts for 10 hours straight, sitting on a wobbly bench while getting salty spray in your face. Blistered hands, aching back, complete exhaustion. You'd arrive at the raid site already physically and mentally drained, even before the first sword was drawn. But once land disappeared over the horizon, the real test began. The North Atlantic is not a calm sea. Storms could strike suddenly. The saga of Olaf Tryggvason describes a storm that scattered the fleet and sank ships like splinters. The longship's flexible hull would bend with the waves, creaking and groaning. Imagine riding in a car where the floor constantly deforms. Huge waves would wash over the low gunwales, drenching everything with icy water. The task of bailing water became as crucial as managing the sail. It was a constant battle against the elements, where one wrong maneuver could cost the entire crew their lives. For a modern person unaccustomed to pitching, seasickness would be a death sentence. It wasn't just nausea, it was a state of complete physical and mental collapse. Constant vomiting leads to rapid dehydration. Medically speaking, it's a fast track to a state where the heart simply lacks enough blood volume to pump. It's like the worst case of rotavirus, but instead of a bed, you have wet planks, and instead of clean water, a rationed portion of foul liquid from a barrel. You couldn't eat, drink, or work. In conditions where fresh water was precious, a few days of such illness meant certain death from exhaustion and kidney failure. They had no seasickness pills. Hypothermia was another invisible enemy. Your wool and leather clothing, even if water resistant, would eventually become soaked. Wool contains lanolin, a natural grease that repels water, but its effect correct isn't infinite. In the North Sea's water, which rarely exceeds 17 degrees Celsius, 62 degrees Fahrenheit, even in summer, wet clothing draws heat from the body 25 times faster than dry clothing. There was nowhere to dry off. You were constantly in wet, cold clothes. Body temperature slowly but surely dropped. This led to decreased reaction time, apathy, and ultimately death. And finally, navigation. The sun, the stars' watercolor, bird flight. Yes, they might have had a sunstone, a crystal that helped determine the sun's position on cloudy days. But this was no GPS. It's like trying to find your way in an unfamiliar city when your phone's dead and all you have is a broken compass. In fog, there was complete disorientation. Imagine the psychological pressure. You're in the middle of a boundless ocean, not knowing exactly where you are or where you're going. This constant stress was as exhausting as the physical hardships. And what about food? Forget about feast tables with roasted meat. The diet consisted mainly of foods that wouldn't spoil for weeks. Dried cod, hard as wood, heavily salted meat, and hardtack. These hardtack biscuits, essentially bricks of flour and water, had to be soaked in beer to avoid breaking your teeth. Sometimes the diet included hakarl, fermented shark, whose pungent ammonia smell could knock a modern person off their feet. This was food for survival, not enjoyment. Monotonous, tough, and almost tasteless. But even these meager provisions were under threat. Moisture and heat took their toll. Weevils infested the flour, which sailors grimly called extra meat. But the real killers were invisible enemies. Bacteria, mold on meat, salmonella, E. coli. Food poisoning wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. Dysentery, a tormenting illness causing dehydration and internal bleeding, could wipe out half the crew before they even saw an enemy shore. Fresh water was an even bigger problem. It was stored in wooden barrels, where it quickly became stagnant and green. After a couple of weeks at sea, the water turned into a warm green slime that smelled of rotten eggs. It was strictly rationed, dispensed in small portions. To mask the taste, a bit of beer or honey might be added, but this only disguised the problem. Thirst was your constant companion. You drank rot, risking death from the very thing meant to save you. Hygiene was non-existent. There were no latrines on the ship. All bodily needs were taken care of over the side. Now imagine trying to do that during a storm on slippery planks, clinging to the side while icy waves crashed over you. One clumsy move and you were in the water. In calm weather, all waste simply drifted alongside the ship, creating an unbearable stench. In these cramped, filthy conditions, diseases spread instantly. Lice, scabies, and skin infections from any scratch were common. And at the heart of this floating hell was iron discipline. The captain, or chieftain, wielded absolute power. His word was law, and disobedience was punishable by death. Stealing water or food could get you thrown overboard without question. No trial, no investigation. The alternative was being declared a nithing, an outcast stripped of all rights. After that, anyone could kill you without consequence. It wouldn't be considered murder, but a removal of dishonor. This wasn't a band of friends seeking adventure. It was a miniature military dictatorship where the survival of the entire crew depended on unquestioning obedience and brutal order. And so, after weeks of such torment, you finally sighted land, but you weren't a fresh, vigorous warrior. You were dehydrated, exhausted, your body suffering from a lack of vitamin C, scurvy, gums bled, teeth loosened. It was like forcing someone who had just run an ultramarathon with the flu to immediately enter combat. You took the first blow in a state of extreme physical decline. Rage in battle wasn't just bravery, but the desperation of a person who had nothing left to lose. Imagine you were wounded, an arrow in the shoulder or a sword blow to the leg. That would likely be the end for you. There was no anesthesia. Archaeologists find surgical instruments from that era, tweezers, probes, knives. Imagine them probing your wound with these to extract an arrowhead, all while you were fully conscious. The wound was washed, at best, with seawater or urine, then cauterized with a hot iron to stop the bleeding. Pain shock could kill you on the spot. Antibiotics and antiseptics didn't exist. Any deep wound was almost guaranteed to become infected. Gangrene, tetanus, sepsis. Sometimes wounds were covered with sphagnum moss, which has some antiseptic properties, but this was little comfort against staphylococcus. There was also a primitive yet gruesome test. A person with an abdominal wound was given strong onion soup. If the smell of onion soon emanated from the wound, it indicated a perforated intestine, a death sentence. Treatment boiled down to waiting to see if you lived or died. Even if you survived battle without serious injury, you witnessed death and brutality in its ugliest form. forms. The screams of the wounded, blood, the agony of comrades. The phenomenon of berserkers falling into uncontrolled rage is today viewed by some historians not as magic, but as a manifestation of severe combat stress disorder, a kind of dissociative state caused by the horror of battle. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not a concept they knew, but they certainly suffered from it. This experience left scars not only on the body, but on the soul. But the journey home was no easier. On the contrary, the ship, now laden with plunder and possibly captives, became even more cramped. Imagine the smell of that vessel, a pungent mix of sweat, caked blood, pus from infected wounds, the fear of slaves, and salty decay. Added to this were the wounded. They groaned, delirious, and died right on board, spreading contagion and exacerbating the already grim atmosphere. The longship transformed into a floating infirmary and morgue simultaneously. Empty spaces on the rowing benches served as a silent reminder of the expedition's cost, of those who would never see home again. And the cruelest irony was to die precisely on the way back. To survive storm, hunger, and battle, only to succumb to infection when your home fjord was just days away. This was the last, most insidious trap, to die of tetanus, your muscles locked in a continuous spasm just a couple of miles from home, seeing the outlines of your native cliffs. That was the ultimate tragedy. All the glory, all the silver you carried with you lost all meaning. You became just another body that had to be quickly thrown overboard to prevent the spread of disease. Many who embarked on these expeditions never returned. Their grave became the bottom of the sea or a foreign shore, and the cause of death was more often not an enemy's sword, but those very everyday trifles that we treat with a single pill today. Let's summarize. A modern person on a Viking expedition would, with 99% certainty, not be killed by battle. They would be killed by dehydration from seasickness in the first week, dysentery from foul water in the second, sepsis from a common splinter in the third, or even a cold escalating into pneumonia from constant hypothermia. Our bodies, pampered by comfort, hygiene, and antibiotics, are simply not prepared for such an aggressive environmental assault. Our clean intestinal microbiome would be defenseless against their dirty bacteria, like a houseplant against herbicide. This forces us to look at the Vikings in an entirely new light. Their greatest feat wasn't the taking of Paris or the sacking of Lindisfarne Monastery in 793. The true feat was to cross the North Sea and arrive at Lindisfarne in a state where you could still wield an axe, not die of exhaustion. Their main triumph was simply enduring the journey itself. They weren't superhumans, but products of the harshest natural selection. Their survival was a victory of human endurance over nearly impossible conditions. The romantic myth of the Vikings is convenient because it allows us to admire their strength while ignoring the horrific price they paid for it. The average life expectancy in that era barely reached 35 to 40 years. Every expedition was a gamble where your entire short life was at stake. But the real story is far more instructive. It reminds us how fragile our comfortable world has become and what incredible resilience can be found in humans when they have no choice but to survive. The true legacy of the Vikings isn't the sagas of battles, but the silent story of survival against all odds.